Obedience to the opaque. Power in systems we do not understand. You receive a decision you cannot contest. A form rejects you. A queue reroutes you. A score shifts. And the reason is a sentence so vague it might as well be silence. The clock is running. The process is rigid. And the fastest path is to comply. Even if compliance feels like guessing what an unseen gatekeeper wants. Most people recognize this friction. You do not agree, you do not fully understand, but you still adjust your behavior. That is the daily shape of power in a technical society. Authority exercised through outputs, constraints, and the quiet pressure to move on. People obey systems they do not understand because opaque systems convert uncertainty into dependence. They constrain choices, reward compliance, and present outputs as objective enough to be treated as final. This sermon will examine the structure of that obedience, how it is produced, stabilized, and rationalized, without claiming that all systems are malicious, that understanding is always possible, or that there is a simple remedy. It will not offer a set of steps or a program for resistance. It will not declare that technology is uniquely corrupting. It will not pretend that past arrangements were free of coercion. It will describe a set of incentives and failure modes that make obedience a predictable outcome when complexity rises and decision speed is valued. Power is often imagined as a person giving orders. In modern systems, power is frequently a property of design. What a process permits, what it blocks, what it measures, and what it ignores. Power is the ability to shape outcomes by shaping the available options. It does not require hostility, it requires leverage. Authority in this setting is not merely legitimacy or tradition. Authority is the socially accepted right of a system to decide, especially when the decision cannot be practically appealed. A person may disagree with a decision and still accept the system's authority because the cost of refusal is high, unclear, or delayed. An algorithm is not best understood as a mysterious intelligence. It is a procedure often executed by software that transforms inputs into outputs according to rules, learned patterns, or both. The word matters less than the function. It produces decisions at scale. When decisions are produced quickly, repeatedly, and with a consistent format, they gain the appearance of neutrality. A proxy is a stand-in measurement used when the real thing is difficult to capture. We use proxies because reality is expensive. If a system wants trustworthiness, it may measure missed payments or late responses. If it wants quality, it may measure completion rate. Proxies are not lies, they are simplifications. But every simplification has a failure mode. A feedback loop is a cycle in which outputs influence future inputs. When a system's decision changes a person's opportunities, and those changed opportunities affect the next decision, the system is not merely observing behavior, it is shaping it. Feedback loops can stabilize good outcomes or harden errors. Optimization is the act of improving a metric or target. It is tempting to treat optimization as synonymous with progress, but optimization is always toward what and at what cost. A system can be highly optimized and still misaligned with human meaning. A system can reduce visible failures while increasing hidden ones. A few assumptions should be stated plainly. First, modern life forces division of labor. No person can personally validate every component in the systems they rely on. Dependence is not a moral flaw, it is an engineering fact of complexity. Second, time and attention are scarce resources. When a decision must be made quickly, people will use shortcuts, reputation, ritual, interface design, and social proof. These shortcuts are not stupidity, they are adaptations. Third, the difference between metric and meaning is persistent. Meaning includes values, context, and purpose. Metrics are compressions. We can improve metrics, but we should not confuse them with the thing they attempt to represent. With those terms in place, the question, why do people obey systems they do not understand, becomes less psychological and more structural. Obedience is often the rational response to constraints, incentives, and uncertainty. Consider how authority forms when understanding is unavailable. One source is asymmetry of information. If a system has access to more data about you than you have about it, its criteria, its thresholds, its exceptions, it can predict and shape your behavior while remaining difficult to predict in return. This asymmetry produces a quiet dominance, not by force, but by opacity. Another source is asymmetry of cost. Appealing a decision might require time, specialized language, documentation, or repeated interactions. If the cost of contesting is higher than the expected benefit, compliance becomes rational even when the decision seems wrong. Another source is repetition. A decision delivered once may be argued with. A decision delivered thousands of times across a population becomes a background condition. Repetition dulls outrage and strengthens habit. Another source is apparent objectivity. Outputs generated by machines, forms, and standardized rules can feel less negotiable than judgments made by people. Even when the rules were written by people and the data was selected by people, the format of the output can create a perception of inevitability. In plain terms, when a system looks consistent, fast, and impersonal, it often becomes easier to obey than to question, even if it is poorly understood. This raises a difficult distinction. Trust is not the same as understanding. Trust can be earned through reliability, transparency, and accountability. But in many technical environments, trust is induced through dependency. You trust because there is no alternative that fits within your constraints. If power is the ability to shape outcomes, then power in technological societies often appears as a choreography of limited options. The question is not only do you agree, but what can you do next? Systems often win that second question. The central paradox is this: the more complex a society becomes, the more it must rely on systems that exceed individual understanding, yet the less individuals understand, the more authority those systems acquire, and the harder it becomes to correct them. This paradox is not a flaw in a particular technology. It is a tension between scale and comprehension. Scale demands standardization, standardization demands rules, rules demand categories, categories demand proxies, proxies distort reality, distortion creates edge cases demand exceptions. Exceptions weaken standardization. The system then reasserts standardization to restore scale. This cycle is not accidental. It is the structural rhythm of large systems. Within that rhythm, optimization becomes both necessary and hazardous. Optimization can increase speed. Speed can reduce friction for many, but speed can also compress deliberation. The faster a system must decide, the fewer contextual signals it can consider, and the more it leans on proxies. When a proxy is wrong, speed spreads the error quickly. Optimization can increase consistency. Consistency can reduce arbitrary treatment, but consistency can also harden a mistaken model. A consistent error becomes more damaging than an inconsistent one because it is predictable and therefore difficult to escape. Optimization can reduce cost. Reduced cost can widen access, but reduced cost can also reduce accountability because accountability is expensive. Explanation takes time. Appeals require staff. Audits require tooling. When the incentive is to cut cost, the first casualties are often the mechanisms that allow correction. Good intentions can produce bad outcomes through incentives. A system might be built to reduce risk, increase safety, improve quality, or allocate resources fairly. Each aim can be sincere, yet if the system is rewarded only for hitting a metric, it will learn to treat the metric as the goal. This is not cynicism, it is how optimization behaves under constraint. Let us examine the structure. A metric is chosen because it is measurable. The system is evaluated on that metric because evaluation needs a number. Operators receive rewards for improving the number because incentives must be clear. Then behavior shifts to improve the number, including behavior that does not improve the underlying reality. This is a failure mode of proxy-based governance. The proxy becomes a target. At the individual level, one failure mode is compliance drift. A person adjusts small behaviors to match what they suspect the system wants. Phrasing, timing, formatting, choices that are not intrinsically meaningful but seem instrumental. The person learns to speak to the system rather than to the reality. Over time, the person's own sense of purpose can be replaced by a sense of eligibility. Compliance drift rarely feels like surrender. It feels like being practical. The adjustment is small. The cost of refusing is uncertain. The reward of compliance is immediate. A feedback loop forms. Comply, receive a smoother path, comply again. Eventually, the system's categories become the person's self-description, because the categories are what the system responds to. At the system level, a distinct failure mode is automation bias combined with diffusion of responsibility. When decisions are produced by an automated or standardized process, humans involved in the chain may treat the output as authoritative, even when they sense it is wrong. The system says so becomes a shield against judgment. This failure mode does not require laziness. It can arise from a mismatch of incentives. If a worker is punished for deviating from the system but not rewarded for correcting it, deviation becomes irrational. If an operator is measured on throughput, careful review is a threat to their evaluation. If an organization is judged on consistency, exceptions look like risk. In such environments, a decision can become unappealable, not because appeals are forbidden, but because every actor has an incentive to avoid being the exception maker. Another system-level failure mode is legibility pressure. The system demands that people become simple enough to be processed. Whatever is not legible to the system becomes a liability. People then reshape their lives into what the system can read. The system does not merely describe reality, it produces a narrower reality that fits its input fields. This is where power becomes quiet. There may be no explicit command. There is only an environment in which some behaviors pass smoothly and others trigger friction. The paradox deepens when we consider trust. Trust is often treated as a moral quality. The trusting person is naive. The skeptical person is wise. In systems, trust is frequently an economic relationship. You trust what you must rely on. If the system is the only gateway to a resource, then trusting it, treating it as real, adapting to it, is the cost of entry. A system can also borrow authority from its own appearance. Interfaces that present results in clean tables, precise decimals, or confident labels can create a perception of accuracy. Precision is not the same as truth, but it often reads as truth. There is also the tension between transparency and usability. A fully transparent system can overwhelm people with details, making it functionally opaque. A simplified explanation can become misleading. A system can be transparent in theory and unchallengeable in practice. And there is the tension between accountability and scale. Accountability requires a chain of responsibility. Who decided, based on what, with what authority, and with what recourse? Scale, especially automated scale, tends to fragment that chain. Responsibility is distributed among designers, data collectors, policy writers, operators, and auditors. Each actor can say, truthfully, I did not make the final decision. The system's authority increases as the humans behind it become less visible. These tensions do not fully resolve because they arise from genuine trade-offs. We want fairness, which pulls us toward consistent rules. We want mercy, which pulls us toward context. We want speed, which pulls us toward automation. We want safety, which pulls us toward caution. We want innovation, which pulls us toward change. We want stability, which pulls us toward continuity. A technical society is often a negotiation among these competing goods. When the negotiation is hidden inside a model or a process document, it is still a negotiation. It is simply less visible. Power is exercised in that invisibility. The core question, why people obey, has an uncomfortable answer. They obey because the system can make disobedience costly without ever issuing a threat. The system needs only to be the path. When obedience becomes the default response to opaque systems, the first-order effect is efficiency. Things move, decisions arrive on time, disputes are reduced, sometimes because they are resolved, sometimes because they are made impractical. The second-order effects are more subtle and more persistent. One second-order effect is value drift. The system's metrics begin to stand in for the community's values because the metrics are what is repeatedly referenced. When a system reports a number regularly, the number becomes a proxy not only for performance, but for worth. What is counted becomes what is discussed. What is discussed becomes what is managed. What is managed becomes what is pursued. This does not require anyone to abandon values consciously. It occurs through attention. Attention is a scarce resource, and metrics are efficient consumers of attention because they are simple, comparable, and easy to circulate. Meaning is slower. Another second-order effect is behavioral homogenization. When systems reward certain forms of legibility, people converge toward those forms. They choose the options that produce predictable outputs. They avoid actions that trigger review, uncertainty, or delay. Over time, the population becomes easier to process, not because the system understands them better, but because they have adapted to the system's limited vocabulary. A third second-order effect is the normalization of non-explanation. When a system delivers decisions without reasons, people begin to accept that reasons are optional. The expectation shifts. An outcome is treated as sufficient. Irrationality becomes a luxury. This is a change in the culture of accountability. A fourth second-order effect is the emergence of eligibility thinking. People learn to frame their lives in terms of passing thresholds. The question, "Is this good?" is gradually displaced by, "Will this be accepted?" This shift can occur in workplaces, education, finance, logistics, and bureaucratic services, anywhere a gatekeeping system stands between a person and an opportunity. Eligibility thinking is efficient for the system. It is costly for meaning, because it places the system's categories above the person's own reasons. Another effect is the persistence of errors through feedback loops. If a system denies a person an opportunity, the person's future data may reflect fewer opportunities, fewer transactions, fewer credentials, fewer successful completions, fewer recorded achievements. The system then reads the thinner record as evidence of lower suitability and continues the denial. The loop can occur without malice. It is an artifact of using historical data as a proxy for future potential. This is why second-order effects persist. They become self-reinforcing. Once a system shapes behavior, it begins to generate the evidence that appears to justify its own rules. A further consequence is the shifting of responsibility from judgment to procedure. When people are embedded in system-driven environments, they often learn that what matters is not whether a decision is wise, but whether it is compliant. This produces a moral inversion. A person can cause harm while feeling innocent because they followed the process. Another person can do good while being punished because they violated protocol. The incentives are not aligned with discernment, they are aligned with auditability. Auditability is not a vice. It is often necessary, but it is a proxy. The ability to prove compliance can become more important than the ability to do what is appropriate. Another consequence is the stratification of understanding. In complex systems, some people must understand more than others. This is unavoidable. But when the gap becomes large, it produces a class of interpreters who can speak the system's language, and a class of subjects who must accept outputs. Power accrues to those who can translate ambiguity into action. This includes technical expertise, but it also includes institutional position, who can request exceptions, who can access logs, who can change parameters. This stratification changes social trust. People may cease to trust each other directly, and instead trust the system as a mediator. The system becomes the witness, the ledger, the arbiter. Interpersonal trust is replaced by procedural trust. Procedural trust can be robust, but it is also brittle. When the procedure fails, the foundation of trust is not merely cracked. It may be absent. Yet these consequences do not imply that the alternative is simple. Removing systems does not remove power, it redistributes it. Making everything discretionary increases the power of individual gatekeepers. Replacing standardized criteria with informal judgment can reintroduce arbitrariness. Increasing transparency can overwhelm people. Increasing human review can slow processes and introduce inconsistent outcomes. The point is not to romanticize either the system or its absence. The point is to notice the trade-offs encoded in design. When we choose scale, we often choose proxies. When we choose proxies, we often choose a particular kind of obedience. Obedience persists because it is rewarded, and because it is often the only way to function within the constraints of time, complexity, and dependency. If one wants to understand why obedience feels natural, consider the psychological economy created by systems. A system provides relief from uncertainty. It provides a clear next step. Enter data, follow instructions, accept the output, continue. This reduction of uncertainty is a genuine benefit. It frees attention. But it can also train attention away from questioning. The person's attention learns what the environment repeatedly rewards. That is the deepest second-order effect. Attention becomes aligned with the system's needs. People watch what the system watches. They learn to care about what the system can see. No malice is required. The incentives and feedback loops suffice. Why do people obey systems they do not understand? Because obedience is often the least costly way to convert complexity into a livable routine. That answer is incomplete, and it leaves a tension that should not be rushed past. If obedience is rational under constraint, then the moral story of people should simply question more becomes inadequate. Questioning requires time, expertise, and often social permission. Even when those exist, questioning may not change the output. A system can be indifferent to critique. At the same time, if obedience becomes habitual, then power becomes less visible and therefore less accountable. Habit converts temporary expedience into permanent arrangement. This is not a dramatic takeover, it is a gradual settling. There is an additional paradox. Understanding can increase dependence. As one learns more about a system, one may also learn how many other systems depend on it, how many constraints are coupled together, how many trade-offs are real. Understanding can produce humility, but it can also produce resignation, a sense that the system is too entangled to alter. In that case, knowledge does not liberate, it clarifies limits. Yet resignation is not the only possible outcome of clarity. Clarity can also refine the questions. Instead of asking whether a system is good or bad, one can ask, what does it optimize? What proxies does it reward? What failure modes does it create? Who bears the cost of errors? Who benefits from opacity? What feedback loops make it self-reinforcing? What happens when the proxy diverges from the meaning? Those questions do not yield a neat resolution, they yield a map of constraints. And within constraints, the key discipline is attention, not attention in the sense of devotion, but attention in the sense of measurement and noticing. What captures attention tends to govern behavior. If a system captures attention with a score, the score begins to govern. If a system captures attention with compliance checklists, checklists begin to govern. If a system captures attention with throughput, throughput begins to govern. It is possible to live with systems while refusing to treat their outputs as the whole of reality. It is also possible to recognize that one's own reasoning is shaped by incentives, that one's own independent judgment can be a response to reward structures one did not choose. The uncomfortable space is this: people obey not only because they are coerced, but because they cooperate with what makes their lives navigable. And the systems persist not only because someone insists on them, but because they are useful, and because the cost of redesign is distributed while the benefit is uncertain. There is no final sentence that dissolves this. The question is meant to remain active. When an output feels inevitable, what has made it so? When a process feels unchallengeable, what incentives guard it? When an explanation is absent, who is spared the burden of accountability? This is not a call to reject systems. It is an insistence on seeing what systems do. They translate values into constraints, and then present the constraints as facts. Clarity requires restraint.